Hello, this is Adam for American Teacher on YouTube. If you haven't, please click subscribe and give me a thumbs up and leave some comments or questions in the comment section below. Okay, a couple of days ago I mentioned that I would talk about the recent protests in South Africa and in Cuba. And you might think, well, what do these have in common? What commonality is there between these two? Well, Cuba is an authoritarian country and South Africa is a democracy. So what's the connection? And I think, as in most grassroots uprisings in a country, they're fomented by economic inequality. Reading from the Daily Maverick, Andrew Gasnalar wrote an article published July 14th, 2021 in the Daily Maverick, an op-ed, and he says South Africans have been contending with unbelievable levels of lawlessness, looting, and violence on both public and private property. Anxiety, uncertainty, and fear continue to ripple across the country, far beyond the disastrous events that have consumed parts of KwaZulu-Natal and Gauteng. Forgive me if I'm mispronouncing the names. We struggle with what's unfolding not because it seems impossible, but because our worst fears are being screened on a constant loop. How do we reconcile what we see taking place in Alexandria, Meadowlands, Daveyton, Heidelberg, and elsewhere in the country? He goes on to say that South Africa's past is one of exclusion, deprivation, violence, systemized racism and abuse, corruption, and the exercise of public power intended to humiliate, dehumanize, and constrain the majority of South Africans. He says the lived experience of the vast majority continues to be shaped by an exclusionary system that has been far too slow to change. Hampered by corruption, malfeasance, and incompetence, our governments since 1994 have moved us towards a transformative South Africa, but have fallen short of the aspirations and hopes of millions. And then the author goes on to point out the economic inequalities. Unfortunately, the systemic and structural realities of South Africa are underpinned by the fact that it's a country of immense inequity and exclusion. The World Bank pegs the Gini coefficient at 0.63. However, recent research published by the Southern Center for Inequality Studies and the World Inequality Lab has evolved our understanding beyond the narrow lens of income to appreciate the scope of wealth inequality in South Africa. This research provides a staggering reflection on what South Africa is. Quote, the top 10% own 86% of aggregate wealth, and the top 0.1% own close to one-third. The top 0.01% of the distribution, 3,500 individuals, concentrate 15% of household net worth, more than the bottom 90% as a whole. Such high levels of inequality can be accounted for in all forms of assets at the top end, including housing, pension funds, and other financial assets. End quote. The author goes on to say the undeniable truth is that the only route to wealth generation in this country, referring to South Africa, is through access to decent and sustainable employment opportunities. Unless one is born into networks and systems that have enabled access through inheritance. So there's immense economic inequality in South Africa, despite it going from a system of apartheid to one where the government is elected democratically, and one in which the majority population is enabled to vote. So inequities persist. Another article in the Deccan Herald from AFP, dated July 14th, 2021, says South Africa is facing its most serious crisis since white minority rule ended in 1994. Violence and looting triggered by the jailing of ex-president Jacob Zuma have claimed 72 lives and dealt a blow to a sickly economy. The article in the Deccan Herald goes on to say, here's the background that helps explain the story. The race-based system of apartheid that favored the white minority over the black majority became official government policy in 1948. The African National Congress, or ANC, was founded in 1912 to defend the interests of the black majority. The ANC was banned in 1960 after the Sharpeville massacre, where 69 demonstrators were killed by the police. Its top leaders were locked up in 1964. In 1976, the crackdown on the uprising in the Soweto township left hundreds dead. The international community took sanctions against the white regime. ANC leader Nelson Mandela, who had spent 27 years in jail for his efforts to overthrow apartheid, became South Africa's first black president in 1994 after the ANC's victory in the first multiracial elections. Mandela's release from prison in 1990 heralded a new dawn for South Africa, stoking hopes of democracy, prosperity, and equal opportunity. The veteran campaigner stepped down in 1999, leaving the ANC the dominant player on South Africa's political stage, but bogged down in political and graft scandals. The party's internal crisis peaked in 2018 when Jacob Zuma was forced to step down from the presidency after 9 years in office. His successor, Cyril Ramaphosa, promised to stamp out corruption, but has struggled to overcome resistance from Zuma, loyalists, and grassroots ANC members. After Zuma last week began a jail sentence for refusing to testify to an anti-corruption commission, protests snowballed into looting. 3 decades after the abolition of apartheid, South Africa remains a two-speed economy with one of the highest inequality rates in the world Bank says. 3 out of 5 live in poverty. Businesses remain mainly owned by whites, who make up only around 9% of the working population. Most of South Africa's arable land remains in the hands of white farmers. It's one of the most violent countries in the world, with a rate of 35.8 homicides for 100,000 inhabitants. Okay, so in addition, the article says that that South Africa instituted one of the harshest COVID-19 lockdowns in the world, which led the economy to contract by 7% last year. So in South Africa, there's a combination of inequality, bad economy, and systemic inequality and corruption in the government that have fed into this protest in South Africa and the crime wave that swept South Africa. But I would argue that probably the financial problems in South Africa were the biggest factor, have been the biggest factor. Zuma was probably just the spark that lit the flames. in the current protests. Okay, so now I'm going to move on to the protests in Cuba. And the protests in Cuba are getting a lot more coverage in the American media, of course, because Cuba is a lot closer to the U.S. And, the U.S. has had qualms with Cuba for a very long time. So I would also argue that economic inequality and economic problems have played a huge role in the protests in Cuba also. And, as we continue to fight the different variants of COVID, that the economic inequalities in these countries will only become more evident, and the likelihood of protests will only increase. In Cuba, in an article entitled "Why Have Cuba's Simmering Tensions Boiled Onto the Streets?" in The Guardian, this is an article by Ed Augustin in Havana, dated July 13th, 2021. The author says, Cubans are used to queues, or lines, for Americans. But since the pandemic, endless lines, squeezed salaries, and power cuts have become a grinding reality for many millions. And on Sunday, tensions boiled over in the largest anti-government protests for decades. Social media, the pandemic, and beefed up U.S. sanctions, combined with the younger generation hungry for higher living standards, have made for a dangerous cocktail the ruling Communist Party is struggling to contend with. Quote, Cubans need cigarettes, coffee, and food to be happy, end quote, said Ray Alonso, 41, in central Havana on Tuesday. Quote, 4 years ago, we had all that. You could go out and buy a can of cola. Now everything's gone. Of course, people look to the street, end quote. So the author points out that the U.S. Secretary of State, Anthony Blinken, on Monday criticized the Cuban regime for, quote, failing to meet the people's most basic needs, including food and medicine, end quote. Yet for decades, U.S. policies have explicitly been designed to create such shortfalls. When first contemplating sanctions, President Dwight Eisenhower surmised that, quote, if they, the Cuban people, are hungry, they will throw Castro out, end quote. Donald Trump's maximum pressure campaign against the island curtailed foreign exchange inflows. Flights to the island were cut back, cruise ships were banned, remittances were canceled, and U.S. firms were allowed to sue multinationals investing in Cuba. The objective, the then Secretary of State Mike Pompeo reportedly told diplomats, was to, quote, starve the country. Then the pandemic hit, which gutted tourism, one of Cuba's last sources of foreign revenue. The state's response, the Cuban government's response to shrinking revenue was to grudgingly open dollar stores, a move which proved deeply unpopular as it vividly embodied the divide between the haves, with access to foreign currency, and the have-nots. On Sunday, dollar stores across the country were ransacked. So evidently these dollar stores are only available to the richer people in Cuban society, and if they have the foreign currency, they can purchase these rarities, these necessities that are hard to find in Cuba nowadays. So in Cuba, there's also a great economic imbalance. And it is true that the U.S. has, with the exception of President Obama during his last term in office, I think, the U.S. has instituted embargoes against the authoritarian government of Cuba. I actually support the U.S. government embargo of authoritarian states, but I think it should be applied equally to all authoritarian states, not just particular authoritarian states. So let's point out the human rights record in Cuba. Cuban law limits freedom of expression, association, assembly, movement, and the media or press. Concerns have also been expressed about the operation of due process. According to the Human Rights Watch, even though Cuba, officially atheist until 1992, now permits greater opportunities for religious expression than it did in past years and has allowed several religious-run humanitarian groups to operate, the government still maintains tight control on religious institutions, affiliated groups, and individual believers. Censorship in Cuba has also been at the center of complaints. According to the report of the Human Rights Watch from 2017, the government continues to rely on arbitrary detention to harass and intimidate critics, independent activists, political opponents, and others. The report added that the Cuban Commission for Human Rights and National Reconciliation, an independent human rights group that lacks official authorization and is therefore considered illegal by the government, received more than 7,900 reports of arbitrary detentions from January through August 2016. This represents the highest monthly average of detentions in the past 6 years. So basically, Cuba has a horrible human rights record. And we shouldn't overlook that fact. So U.S. sanctions, yes, they contributed to the economic loss in Cuba, but it was also exacerbated by the government's malfeasance and the COVID pandemic, which has basically cut Cuba's tourism income. So in America, this has become a political football. The riots in Cuba, Republicans are accusing Democrats of not speaking out in support of the government protesters in Cuba, and they're trying to say that the Democrats support the authoritarian regime in Cuba, which is demonstrably false. On the website polygraph.info, it points out that on July 11th, Cubans took to the street in anti-government demonstrations, the largest anti-government demonstrations the country has seen in decades, protesting the absence of democratic rights under the country's authoritarian regime, as well as worsening economic conditions amid the COVID-19 pandemic that has led to food and medicine shortages. Thousands of protesters gathered in the island's capital, Havana, holding banners bearing slogans such as freedom and exhausted, and demanded the resignation of President Miguel Diaz-Canel. U.S. President Joe Biden took to social media to voice voice support for the Cuban people and their right to peacefully demonstrate and protest. Quote, "We stand with the Cuban people as they bravely assert their fundamental and universal rights, and as they call for freedom and relief from the tragic grip of the pandemic and from the decades of repression and economic suffering," Biden said. Speaker of the U.S. House of Representatives Nancy Pelosi also tweeted, quote, "The call for freedom and basic rights by the people of Cuba peacefully taking to the streets and marching is an act of great courage. I support the Cuban people in their pursuit of liberty and condemn any violence or targeting of those exercising their rights." End quote. So Cuban Foreign Minister Bruno Rodriguez clapped back in defense of the Cuban government. Quote, "Madam Speaker," in response to Nancy Pelosi, who is a Democrat and the Speaker of the U.S. House of Representatives. So Rodriguez said, quote, "Madam Speaker, unfortunately, you seem to have been misguided. No one who peacefully protested yesterday in Cuba feared or had reason to fear for his or her security. It is no secret that U.S. policy against Cuba aims at generating hardships and social discontent," end quote, he tweeted. Polygraph.info website points out this statement is false. The Cuban Foreign Minister Bruno Rodriguez issued a false statement. The Cuban government violently cracked down on the protesters. More than 100 demonstrators, activists, and journalists have reportedly been arrested or have gone missing since the protests erupted. And they're talking about the recent protests in Cuba this year, this summer, 2021. Videos have surfaced on social media showing protesters being forced into police vans. NBC reported that a popular YouTuber, Dina Stars, was detained by authorities in Cuba during a live interview with a Spanish television news show. Business Insider reported that on July 12th, that AP photographer Ramon Espinosa was left bloodied after an altercation with the police during the protests in Cuba. It posted a photograph of the bloodied reporter still holding a camera and recording the protests. Camila Acosta, a correspondent for the Spanish daily ABC, was one of the many journalists detained by police while covering the protests. Spain demanded her immediate release. So I see that these authoritarian regimes are desperately trying to say that their problems are being caused by other countries or by other outside forces, especially in Cuba, when that story doesn't hold water. Also, I wish the U.S. would stop using the protests as a reason to criticize each other, because the fact that people can protest peacefully in the U.S. and not disappear or not be unlawfully detained or detained arbitrarily is a sign of the democracy that we enjoy in the U.S. and that is not enjoyed by people in Cuba or China or countries like that. But beyond that, to sum up, I think that we're going to see more of these protests worldwide, especially in countries that have long-standing grievances by on the part of the citizens, especially authoritarian countries, and that's what scares me the most, because authoritarian countries, they are not going to take protests sitting down. They're going to arbitrarily detain people, disappear people, and maybe even execute people for protesting. But with economic hardship, these protests will become more likely in the future. And like I said, COVID has caused economic hardship worldwide. So this might be the beginning of a series of protests that are triggered, they might be triggered by seemingly unrelated events, but they have things in common, like long-standing mistreatment of a significant portion of the population, and economic hardship among a significant portion of the population. So let's hope that this is, these events are short-lived, and if anything good comes out of it. I'm skeptical about Cuba becoming more open and treating its citizens more fairly. But we'll have to wait and see. Hopefully that will happen in the future. Okay, if you have any questions or comments, leave them in the comment section below. Thank you for watching American Teacher. Bye-bye.